Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning. Okay, let's see. I think we've got, I see, Mayor McCullen and Dr. Liu.
Here.
And I see Supervisor Ashley. How about Ms. Mitchell and Mrs. Kuehl?
Here yet. Supervisor Kuehl is on her way. She's stuck on the freeway.
But Supervisor Mitchell is not here?
Not here. No.
Not Supervisor, but Mrs. Mitchell is not.
There she is.
Well,
Council member.
Council member Mitchell.
Ah,
We will
gotta admit, Supervisor.
proceed to get started. Oh, there she is there now.
Just walking right in.
Yes. Okay. Well, we'll officially call the Mobile Source Committee meeting of October 20th, 2017. And I think our first presentation this morning is going to be by Dr. Fine, summary of 2017 ozone season and trend analysis. Dr. Fine, are you ready to go?
Yes, Dr. Parker, thank you. So the first two items on the agenda deal with ozone and our challenges with meeting the ozone standards. The first presentation that I'm going to provide is going to talk about our measurements in the field of ozone and talk about this last ozone season and particularly the last 2 years of ozone levels. And as you may be aware, there's been a little bit of an uptick. So we wanted to go in a little bit more depth as to why that might have occurred and what it might mean for our future. And then the second presentation continues on an issue that was brought up during the AQMP regarding our AQMP modeling when it comes to ozone. So they're somewhat related, but the first one's more focused on measurements, and the second one is how our models actually are able to predict those measurements. So just to start with this ozone season, here we have a trend since 1990 of our ozone levels. And it sounds a little complicated, but the way we're measured in terms of meeting the standards for ozone is a little bit complicated. You use a 99th percentile, which comes out to the fourth highest maximum 8-hour level through the year, and then the 1-hour ozone is roughly corresponds to the second highest. So that's why we use those metrics rather than the maximum or the average when it comes to ozone. So if you look at the trends over the last few years, the red line is the 8-hour. The red line is the 1 hour, and the blue line is the 8-hour. And you can see over the years, especially since the early 90s, we've seen tremendous gains. You also can see that year to year you get fluctuations. You get some increases and decreases from year to year. And then also notice the last 2 years, 2016 and 2017, have been a bit higher than, say, the period maybe between 2012 and 2015. So there has been this little bit of uptick. It's been in the news. We're well aware of it, and we've been tracking that very closely. Another way to look at ozone levels is how many days actually exceed the standards. And so this chart shows again that the number of days exceeding both the 8-hour and 1-hour standards have been decreasing over the years. In the blue, we have the 8-hour standard. You can see we were having over 200 days per year in the early 90s, and we were coming down to closer to 120 days a year. Again, you see that same uptick in the last couple years in terms of days over the standard. If you look at the 1 hour, which is in brown, you can see that we were just down to a handful of days in 2013, 2014, 2015 over the standard, which was getting us very close to attainment. And then again, 2016, 2017, you see the same uptick. So it's just different ways of looking at the same measurements and the same data. Another way you can look at it is when are we getting the ozone exceedances. So in this chart, you can see by month since 2000 how many days we get above the standard. And typically, you can see here that July and August are our highest ozone months, moving into September. One thing to notice, and we're talking about 2016, 2017, is a little bit of a change has happened. One of the reasons we've been getting the higher numbers in 2016 and 2017 is that the ozone season looks like it's extending just a little bit earlier. In 2016, we had exceedances in February and March that we didn't typically would see in those numbers, and even in 2017, you see some larger numbers in April and May than you had seen in some of the previous years. So we still get most of the days in June, July, and August exceeding the standards, but what's kind of driving these numbers a little higher is that some of those peripheral months are also seeing more exceedances. So we have ongoing efforts to understand why this happened over the last couple years, and it really comes down to maybe three potential areas. One is meteorology. Obviously, the weather has a big effect on what air quality is day to day, how strong the inversion layer is, how long the inversion layer lasts, how high the inversion layer is. The second is, ozone is a complex process. It's formed in the atmosphere through chemical reactions. It's not like for every, X amount of NOx reductions, you get a corresponding linear response in ozone reductions. It's much more complicated than that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then again, changes in emissions can obviously affect air quality. So that's something else we're looking at. And I'll go into each of these just in a little bit more detail. So for ozone and meteorology, as we said before, 2016 and 2017, we had the increase in the number of days over the standard and the other metrics. Those two summers had a very strong, persistent inversion layer, high pressure aloft, tends to trap pollution near the ground. Warmer temperatures and sunlight also contribute to ozone chemistry and ozone formation. And this wasn't unique to South Coast. These conditions were prevalent up and down the West Coast and the western part of the U.S. And it wasn't just us that had some increases in ozone. It was San Joaquin, even the Bay Area, and other places had some pretty bad ozone years. So it was widespread in terms of ozone. It was widespread in terms of warm temperatures. So that was definitely one of the factors. Another thing we do is we look at different metrics that help us determine whether the weather conditions are conducive to ozone formation. So here we have what we call a MET indicator. Essentially, we can look at the temperature of the air at about 1,500 meters above sea level. And that has turned out to be a very good indicator of the strength of the inversions and also how much ozone formation. So here you could see kind of that correlation between the top line, which is that temperature higher up in the atmosphere, and the ozone level. So you can see last couple years, especially 2017, that indicator was very high, which you would expect higher ozone, even if emissions were held constant, even if other things were being held constant. So our preliminary conclusion from looking at the MET data is this uptick over the last 2 years, the differences in meteorology were probably enough to explain it. We can't say conclusively that was it, but that there is enough in the meteorological data to suggest that the fluctuation was not so much outside the normal historical fluctuations of ozone, and that those 2 years did set up for worse ozone than we have had in previous years. A second factor is, again, the complex chemistry of ozone formation. So we've talked about these, what we call ozone isopleths before. And so because ozone is formed not just from NOx, but also from VOC, and the ozone levels depend not on only the amount of NOx in the atmosphere and the amount of VOC in the atmosphere, it also depends on the ratio of the two. So that's why you get some funny shapes to what we call these ozone isopleths. So if you look at this, you can get some significant NOx and VOC reductions, but you don't change too much from the upper right part of this graph to get down to 2017. It all stays in the red. That's because it doesn't, again, as I said before, a pound of NOx reductions does not equal a certain amount of ozone reduction. So you kind of go along this ridge. If you think of this as like a topological map, and red is like high elevation and high ozone, and blue is low elevation and low ozone, we're kind of walking along the side of the ridge, and we have to do that for a while before we drop into the blue and get to attainment. So the upshot of this is you may not expect that ozone would have been dropping in recent years as rapidly as NOx emissions are dropping or VOC emissions are dropping. You have to get over this ridge or this hump before you can start seeing those reductions. So that's another reason. And then you can get into emission inventories, and then we obviously project NOx to decrease dramatically. We project VOC to decrease. This is due to adopted rules and regulations, especially on the mobile source side, but also on the stationary source side. And you can see from our projections, we project that NOx emissions will continue to decrease through 2020 and beyond due to existing rules and regulations. Now this is projected. This assumes compliance with rules and regulations. This assumes we understand emissions. We can also look at data, real data from the real world, to see whether we see that in the real world. So here's some just annual average NOx emissions, and we can see we do actually see NOx emissions decreasing. So we need to continue to look and make sure that our assumptions on our emission inventory, our projections on emission inventory are correct. We can look at data. We're going to be looking at more satellite data now, can get you some information on emissions and where they're coming from and where they're affecting ozone. But we do think that our projections of NOx emission reductions are accurate, but again, there's always more work to be done on that. So again, there's just kind of like three factors that might contribute to why we haven't seen an ozone decrease or maybe an increase in recent years. So we're looking at everything. We continue to analyze this with all the tools available. Another factor on emission inventory, and I don't want to make too much of this, but VOC emissions are projected to go down, but they also vary year to year because some VOC emissions are what we call biogenic. They come from plant material. Plants, even in a place that's semi-arid like Southern California, do emit a large fraction of VOC emissions, and when you get a lot of rain one year, the leaf area is larger. When there's a larger leaf area, you get more VOCs. So that's another potential factor in the inventory that may have affected emissions, at least over the last year. In any case, we're always trying to improve our emissions inventory and our assessment methods. We're trying to improve our biogenic VOC inventory. We're looking at satellite measurements of NO2, which can help us make sure we're tracking the trends, not just in ozone, but in precursor emissions as well. We've really been, and we'll talk about it a little more in the next presentation, about using real-time measurements to really figure out where and when the emissions are coming from. And then we're always updating the inventory as we move through successive AQMP cycles. So just in summary, there's been this long downward trend. We hope that continues. We did get some increases in 2016, 2017. It could be explained by meteorology alone, but we're also looking at all the other factors. So it just summarizes everything that I've said thus far. So happy to answer any questions on that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fine. One of the things I hear, I've heard a lot of explanations about ozone, but I would love to hear you say exactly what is the correlation, if there is one, between ozone, and we know that ozone itself, because of NOx and VOCs, which are pollutants that we want to get rid of, but to what extent, if we don't basically bring down the ozone level, is it going to allow us to be fixed within a environment that would that we are really kind of locked into, because we're talking about something that has already been formed through a chemical reaction. How is that going to have, if in fact that ozone level cannot be depleted with our normal reductions in this regard? In essence, does it dissipate? Does it go into the black hole, or exactly what happens?
So the chemistry of ozone is such that as soon as the sun goes down, ozone also drops, or at least within a few hours of the sun going down, because it pretty much requires constant sunlight for that chemical reaction to sustain a level of ozone. Over several days, the precursors to ozone do stick around, so you have these multi-day episodes that do carry over some high ozone levels. But within 2 or 3 days, it tends to either blow out of the basin or be dissipated a little bit more. In terms of NOx emissions, we are aware of some recent studies at CSER and other places that have suggested that we may be underestimating NOx emissions. That's why we're looking at that closely. There's some issues with the duty cycle of the control technology on the diesel trucks. There's always questions about the VOC inventory. It's a very hard thing to get at. So we are always looking at all those factors, but all our suggestions are, and even our past experience is, as emissions of NOx and VOC come down, that the longer term trends of ozone will come down.
Okay. Any further questions by any other members of the?
I do have some questions, but I think we can deal with them offline. It has to do with that isoplat and what our goals are for NOx emission reductions and our VOC reductions and the other isoplats that I'd seen. And then the comment you just made about adjusting the inventory based off of the heavy duty cycle stuff that's coming out of CSER, and my impression that it was already dealt with in MFAC. So it's a whole bunch of questions that we can deal with at some other point in time. I know people are here excited about the other two items on the agenda, so we should get to them.
Question.
Yes, go right ahead.
Looking at this chart, it seems to me that if you've got the NOx reductions and VOC reductions out of balance, you're not going to get
Right.
the ozone. You're going to get more ozone.
Yeah, and that's one of the concerns we had during the AQMP, which is why we still need to get VOC reductions at the same time, not just to reduce ozone, but also to avoid an increase in ozone. That tends to be worse in the western part of the basin than in the eastern part of the basin. And I guess the fortunate thing in the western part of the basin, ozone levels tend to be lower anyway, and in many cases are actually below the standard. But it's something we're acutely aware of. The problem is you can't get there through VOC reductions alone. You have to get to the bottom of that chart to get to attainment. So you kind of either got to walk around the hill, or walk over the hill, or maybe just skirt the hill until you get to the other side.
Looking at the number of station days that exceed the standard over a 3-year period, an average, comparing 2004-6 to 2014-16, the number of station days have exceeded the standard, especially in the East San Gabriel Valley through the San Bernardino Valley. You got any explanation for that?
So we still have, I don't know, maybe how many stations out of our 20-some ozone monitoring stations still exceed the standard? Probably most of them. I mean, there's some in the Western Basin that don't, but most of they still exceed. Crestline used to be our highest site, and year to year it still is. But
Are we seeing a shift to the west?
We're starting to see a shift. So
and what's causing that?
It's the time and place of emissions. So again, as you look at those ozone isoplats, it gets complicated. But as you move down that chart, the NOx VOC ratio changes, and it changes in different parts of the basin differently. So in Crestline, you don't really see that bump in that chart. You actually, NOx emission reductions generally get you reductions overall.
What about
But in Redlands, you do see that, and then as you go west, you see more of it. So that's why we're on different parts of the chart. Every station has its own chart like that. So we're starting to see Redlands, and then even moving towards Glendora, some of the higher days are showing the highest levels in those areas.
Has there been an impact on the different types of VOCs that react more slowly?
In terms of emission inventory?
Yes.
It's a good question. I don't have all that information. The model does account for all that, but we'd have to dig into the modeling results a little.
That's okay.
to pull that out. But
No, please don't.
Dr. Fine, isn't a lot of this directly related to, like Crestline, is that all of the fugitive emissions are basically being accumulated in that particular area, not necessarily generated from that area, is that?
that's generally,
Does that have a,
yes, that's true. What happens is, as those areas are developed more than, say, some of the western areas can be developed, you actually get more NOx emissions closer to those stations, and that actually tends to suppress the ozone a little bit because of that NOx-VOC ratio. So while historically, as the population in the Inland Empire was lower, that's why Crestline was kind of the higher site. But then as you have more development, more trucking out, that more NOx emissions in that area, it starts to shift things around a little bit. And it's different at every site. It can get very complex. Let me give the thumbnail view here. But you're absolutely right. It's mostly transport, but local emissions have an effect one way or the other as well.
Any further questions on this subject? Hearing none, then we'll move on to item number 2, the
Members of the public,
2016.
Dr. Parker, do you want to check and see if there's any public comment?
Okay, any public comments on item number 1?
None here in Riverside.
We do have one here in Diamond Bar.
Okay, step up and give us your name and,
Yeah, I'm Ralph Morris. I work for Ramboll Environ. We've been working with the Engine Manufacturers Association over the last year and a half with the AQMP databases. And this issue is really important. The road to attainment is important, as is the 2023 attainment year, and how we get there is important. And there are a lot of factors, as Phil explained. One other one is the VOCs may be going up. But we saw this in the early 2000s. There for the district, we saw the rate of ozone reduction slowed, and they convened a panel of experts to discuss this in 2006, and they came up with a lot of reasons why it did. One was underpredicting VOCs, and overpredicting the rate of reduction of VOCs, the NOx reductions increase ozone, and meteorology, of course, is king. And so what EMA and Ramboll is requesting that you convene another panel to look at this issue, because it is really important. The AQMPs have a bad history of getting to the end point, in this case 2023, and the road to the end point is probably just as important. So I think it's time. It's been over 10 years. There's been a lot of turnover at the district. Got a lot of smart people, but there's institutional knowledge is gone. So that's just a suggestion that the district reconvene an expert panel to look at this important issue. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Staff respond to that, please.
We're open to the idea when we work.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, when we work on the AQMPs, we do have an expert panel. We call it the Scientific Technical Modeling Peer Review Committee. It tends to be during AQMPs, but it's something we could look at to see whether there needs to be some interim meetings and bring up some issues. But we're open to the idea.
We're willing to consider that and report back.
Please do.
Yep.
Okay, that's it for public comment, Dr. Parker.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we'll move right on to item number 2, the 2016 AQMP Modeling Performance.
Good morning. I'm Sang-Mi Lee. I'm Program Supervisor in Air Quality Modeling and Emissions Inventory Group. Today, I'd like to present the performance of modeling used in the last 2016 AQMP. So I first start with how the modeling framework consists of. So the purpose of the goal of the AQMP is to predict future years' ozone and PM concentrations. In order to get there, we use these numerical models that consist of, for example, chemical transport model. And the chemical transport model needs 2 main streams of inputs. One of them is, of course, meteorology that includes the temperature and the wind field and the solar radiation, etc. And then the other important input is emissions inventory. Then each of these components actually consists of 100,000 lines of computer codes and requires weeks of computational time employing thousands of CPUs connected parallelly. So these are the computer modeling framework that supports the AQMP effort to predict future years' ozone and PM concentrations. But then this, the little more brief, more details of modeling effort. So we utilize the state of science modeling platform that consists of CMAQ and WRF, MFAC emissions model, and then in-house emission modeling process tools. All of them are EPA approved and recommended tools. And in addition to that, the approaches and methodology used to come up with the future concentrations all complied with the US EPA's modeling attainment guidance. On top of it, we have collaborated very closely with the California Air Resources Board and then EPA people in Region 9. So we have regular conference calls, almost weekly conference calls with them. And then we also developed the protocol how to approach numerical model to show the attainment together with CARB and then reviewed by EPA and submitted to EPA. On top of it, this whole process of AQMP modeling was a very open and transparent public process, which include STMPR committee, as Dr. Fine mentioned, those are that represent for scientific, technical, and modeling peer review committee. We have met quarterly or bi-monthly, and we had regular meetings with our committee members, and then all the presentations and discussions are all posted on the internet, the committee websites. And also we have the committees consist of academic members, research groups, and then industry members. And then we met with the EMA and the Ramboll multiple times during the process. So given that those are the framework used in the 2016 AQMP, still currently we are in the process of improving the modeling performance. This improving modeling performance is ongoing effort. We constantly improve our capabilities here. But then specifically we use most latest available approved EPA models, and also currently we are utilizing so-called big data set, meaning that the real-time sensor data, those are like gigabyte or terabyte data sets available out there. And then we also use the satellite data, and then in collaboration with other research universities, and then NASA, and then National Weather Service. So those are ongoing efforts, but a little bit of more flavor of these efforts will be presented toward the end of the presentation. So going back to the main question, that then how this EMA Engine Manufacturer Association and then their consultant Ramboll involved in the previous 2016 AQMP process. So this EMA and then Ramboll submitted a comment letter to the AQMP when first released in draft version. We received the comment letters from them, and then when the final version was released, we also received the comment letter from them. And each of them replied to their comments and concerns, and all of those the original letters and staff response are available in the internet, given the addresses given below there. And also Ramboll, the EMA's consultants were invited in STMPR process, and then we invited them to present their views and their analysis or their concerns on our approach during this STMPR advisory group meeting, and the staff responded to their concerns as well. And then we also, we did not stop there. We also shared all our modeling data and analysis tools with them, so we can be as transparent, as open as we could, so they could reproduce if they want, or provide any suggestions depending on their findings. So staff made ensured their involvement during the process of AQMP. And then here, the next the point is the EMA brought a few concerns on our approach. So one of them is, so basically EMA claims that AQMP modeling overestimated the NOx emission reduction needed for the attainment. The rationale behind that was EMA Ramboll utilized the technique called retrospective modeling, or it is also called dynamic evaluation. So what that means is you utilize this modeling platform to the historical event and then see how well model does, and then extrapolate or interpolate that result into future years to see the reduction goals we set for the future years are reasonable or not. And then recently, Ramboll published their result in the publication journal, academic journal, the Atmosphere. And then the next slides go a little more details of this so-called retrospective modeling or dynamic evaluation. So these these figures are from EMA Ramboll's publication. It's their analysis, not the step analysis. So what this chart is showing is, on the x-axis, you will see different locations within the basin, starting with the crestline, Glendora, San Bernardino, and the last column is a peak concentration observed or simulated in the basin. And the length of the bar graph shows the rate of progress. So the reduction of ozone concentration measured per year, and the blue bars are measured rate of progress, and the red ones are simulated rate of progress. So in ideal world, the length of the blue bars and red bars will match each other. But the numerical model, as I say, is fairly comprehensive and then complicated process. Nobody really expected it would give exactly identical answers. So what you see is, depending on geographical locations, some stations get closer to observations, some stations shows a little more discrepancies. But then here, the one point that I'd like to make is, as Dr. Fine explained previously and has a lengthy discussion with the committee members, the peak concentration migrates in the basin. It used to be the crestline. Crestline used to show the highest concentration in the basin, but in the recent years, it is not the case anymore. And in the future years, we expect that peak even migrate further west. So when it comes to this change of dynamics in the basin, the stations that becomes important are foothills stations located at Glendora, Redlands, and San Bernardino. And as circled here in the graph, those stations relatively show better performance than the crestline or other stations. So in all, this graph, it is EMA Ramboll's own analysis shows model performance is fairly good. It's not terribly bad at all. Actually, it looks fairly encouraging for me to see someone else utilizing our own data and come up with this reasonably good agreement. And then this is continuing of Ramboll's retrospective modeling results. So the line graph on the right, if I explain a little bit, then the x-axis is now, it's a year starting from 1995 all the way to 2015. And the vertical axis is the peak ozone concentration. So here, this is the result at the Redland monitoring station. But again, as described in the previous slides, Redlands become the most important station to attain to reach the attainment in the future years. But then for this station, as you can see, one line, that blue line is observed trend, and then red line is model simulated concentrations. So at a glance, it looks reasonably good. But then, so again, as presented in the previous slides, model performance analysis that the Ramboll EMA kind of indicating that the AQMP modeling approach follows the trend reasonably well. But then one would say, depending on the area the time period you choose, for example here, I just draw a line, just a simple animation example. If you choose just a subset of window, and then this blue line is just two endpoints of measurement, and then for the same period, if you plot the trends of the modeled data, it looks like model does not reproduce the observed improvement of ozone concentration. But then just to make a case that it is so time window dependent, if you extend this time window 5 years earlier to the window that I showed in the previously, this line is the measured ozone trend, and then suddenly model is more aggressively predicting ozone reduction. So again, depending on which time frame that rate of progress will look like different. But then if you do this macroscopic perspective, like 20 years, then then it's basically model performance and the measure trend agree reasonably well, fairly well actually. As a model's perspective, this looks really encouragingly well. So with that, but then even with this fairly encouraging the analysis, despite of that, there are limitations. That is not just EMA Ramboll's approach. Any modeling approach would have uncertainties and limitations. But if I may pick a few points here, the ozone concentration have been improved not only South Coast Basin, but the surrounding counties. For example, Central California or Kern County exhibited AQMP in improvement in the last 7 years. Those improvements were not accurately incorporated in EMA's analysis. But also, there always has been changes in the other side of Pacific Ocean. So Asian countries has emissions went up until 2006-07 period, and then recently it has kind of going downtrend. Those kind of trend has to be included in the dynamic evaluation or in the retrospective modeling if you really want to come up with accurate estimation. Also, the last point is, as Dr. Fine presented in the earlier item, the ozone trend has really high fluctuation. There are upticks and downturns, and then especially the last 2 years, the ozone concentration has been increased much higher than we would like to see. So this EMA's approach did not include this recent trend there. So those are something that can improve their trend. So this slide is just reiterating the item 1, the presentation by Dr. Fine. But then having said this, so the next stage is the step and AQMD step. We are not just sitting here and saying that we have done a reasonable job and then that's it. It is not like that. We are moving forward to improve. This constant effort to improve our capability to predict future concentrations. One of them is the traffic sensor data. So everybody these days, whenever you drive, you open up this iPhone and then you check the traffic that's provided by the Google Map. And then that traffic map consists of over 10,000 sensors spread the entire basin. And then we collect all those sensor data. It is gigabyte, terabyte size data, and then we incorporate that into our modeling and model emissions inventory. And the next step is, this one is step of working is not just onward traffics. We also extend our effort to marine traffic. So their port is one of our biggest concerns here, and then there are ocean-going vessel information. Each and every vessels that come into the port has this satellite tracking system. It is automated information system, and the staff was able to access to this data set. And then this tiny little dots, colored dots, actually indicate the location of ocean-going vessels. For example, if you click any of these little dots, it shows something like this: vessel name, vessel type, vessel origin, and the speed and location of it. So we can track the type of vessels and the location of vessels, and then with a little bit of more information, engine types, etc. And then those informations are in the process of being included in emission inventory. And then another point is aircraft emission. So traditionally, aircraft emission is incorporated in the ground level, in the surface level. But then sometimes the picture says 1,000 words, better than 1,000 words. So we brought up this photograph here. This aircraft, as you can see, it is taking off, and then you see this black smoke coming out of aircraft. And then that indicates this emission needs to be distributed properly along this flight's takeoff or landing track instead of just assigning everything on the surface. So this kind of information is also available through ACARS, the commercial aircraft data. So STEB is in a process of accessing these data and so utilizing these data into emissions inventory as well. And then one more thing I'd like to add is collaboration with other agencies. So one can do only so much a job, but then by collaborating with other experts in the nation or in the world, we can improve our capabilities far much more. So one of the examples is Jet Propulsion Laboratory located here at Caltech locally, and then also many NASA scientists. We collaborate with them to incorporate the satellite data into our modeling analysis. And then with this data, we can validate there's lots of emission uncertainties. There are so many uncertainties in the emission inventory, but then currently the regulatory emission inventory is so-called the bottom-up approaches. But with this satellite information, it will bring up different perspective. Now we're looking top-down. We don't care where they are coming from, but we would have better information how much they are coming, and then how they changed over time, and then how they changed with respect to other locations in the California or in the nation. So that is the use of satellite data. Also with the satellite data would indicate how much transport over the Pacific might have been currently or in the past 10 or 20 years, and then how that trend might affect in the future years. So these kind of utilizing more state-of-art data set and analysis and collaboration with leading academic and research institutes outside are underway. So having said that, so summary of this presentation is, so one would not expect the model would predict exact ozone concentrations. But then you should, but because of the uncertainties in meteorology and emissions, also growth projections for the future years. But then the South Coast AQMD study is fairly confident to say we use the most updated emissions inventory, and then we work very closely with the EPA and CARB, and then we complied with the guidance given by EPA. And on top of it, we are constantly updating our tools and on our frameworks, and also emission inventory by Clean Air Act, we are required to update every 4 to 5 years, as every AQMP cycle comes. But in practice, this is kind of going back to the specific concerns raised by EMA. In practice, the need for large NOx reductions to achieve ozone standard is not going to change significantly due to the performance of model framework or improvement of model framework. But if measurements show that ozone levels are improving faster or slower than predicted, then emission reduction strategy will be modified and will need to be modified in the subsequent AQMP updates. And then lastly, I'd like to add that staff will work closely with EMA, Ramboll, and then all the stakeholders to improve model performance and to make our process as transparent as possible. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Singh. I have one question that has always concerned me. On the West monitoring, which you said that is increasing really for ozone levels, is that because we've just now started putting in more monitoring on the West? Because I cannot really see why that should have had that significant of an increase. In reality, it may be because we're just now finding it out. But have we increased the number of monitors that we have that we are now putting into our models?
Dr. Parker, this is Philip Fine. Our monitoring network is pretty stable when it comes to ozone monitoring. So these increases aren't because we put out a new monitor and discovered some areas with higher ozone. These are generally sites with long-term monitoring going back decades.
Okay. Further questions by any of the members of the committee?
Have we over-controlled for air pollution?
No.
Okay,
We're still working on the 1 hour stuff.
I noticed that in the last presentation. And the trend continues, we're not getting any closer.
Do we have any public comments there then? If none of our members have any?
We do
Questions
have
or
a comment
concerns?
here, Dr. Parker.
Yeah, sorry, Dr. Parker, my last comment here, but again, this is Ralph Morris with Ramboll Environment, and I've been working with EMA, and it's not that, we're making we're attaining our standards, but it is about improving the modeling tools that we use to attain the standards. And this dynamic evaluation that we've been doing with EMA for the last year and a half is a powerful tool to evaluate the model, and evaluate the model for the way you use it. How does the model respond to changes in emissions? Since you can't do that in the future, you have to look in the past. And so this is something that both EMA and Ramboll have been encouraging the district to do. And it's also in EPA's guidance for ozone and PM 2.5 SIP modeling as recommended to do. So we are recommending that the district partake in a dynamic evaluation. And we've learned some stuff doing this. Again, the VOC emissions look questionable. I think part of the reason for the increase in 2017 ozone may be due to increased VOC emissions. So anyway, I have a memo here that I've sent to the committee, and I'll leave out here so we don't take up more time, but we are requesting that the district look at the dynamic evaluations, see whether they can learn why the model's not as responsive as the atmosphere, and improve the modeling databases so we can do and use it in future AQMPs. Now that we're in between AQMPs, might actually have time to do that without the fire drill the AQMP goes on. So this is a powerful tool, and I've been involved with these AQMPs dating back to the 1989 one. So I've watched this process, and things are a lot better today. In fact, the current databases are much better than just the past 2012 AQMP, and our dynamic evaluation shows that. So that's our request. And I'll leave the memo over on the table for people who want to get into modeling details. Thank you very much.
If I could just ask, saying me, from the presentation, you are looking at the dynamic modeling. You are using it to true up. So I guess I don't understand, because it sounds like we're doing exactly what you're asking.
Well, you do the dynamic evaluation comparing, can we predict the past changes in ozone, and then you try to improve the model inputs to make it match better, to make the model be more responsive, like the real atmosphere has been to changes in emissions, resulting in changes in ozone.
But I
And
thought
just for
that's what
example,
saying you just described.
But- So
well, those results are results that we did.
those are their results. So we were just
So we sent their databases to them in February, and so we don't want them just to repeat what we did. It's to figure out how can we improve the databases and make the model a more accurate and predictive tool for the future year modeling.
So,
Saying me,
as Sangmi showed, yeah, there may be certain areas of the basin and certain sites where the responsiveness of the model, depending on the time period you pick, may be a little bit different than what was observed. There's also other sites that we think match pretty well. It's all great information. We commend Ramboll for doing this work. It's like it saved us some work. We're looking at the results, and if it suggests any changes to inputs or modeling that are within what we have the freedom to change, we're all ears and want to work with them and others to improve the model. There's no doubt about that. But I think the main point is that what we're talking about here is not going to obviate the need for the current efforts of the AQMP to reduce NOx emissions, and VOC emissions, which we're also working on. It's really, these are technical things, and whether we need, an extra 100 tons a day in 2023 or 95 or 90, it's not going to change staff's actions to bring about those changes, because we know it's such a huge task. As we get closer and we refine the modeling, if there's changes, there's time to adjust our efforts for those last few tons.
But again, I just want to sort of reiterate what Sangmi said, and that is you're constantly refining the model.
Exactly.
You're constantly working
Yes.
with academia, with industry, with government. So that refinement, that ongoing research, it doesn't stop. Okay. Thanks.
Is there a large deviation between the two that would be significant?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Dr. Parker, could you repeat the question?
Is there a large deviation between the results of the two approaches that would be significant?
So, Dr. Parker, as discussed briefly during the presentation, if you choose a time window little more selectively, you can make the comparison worse, or you can make the comparison very promising or rosy. But in general, if you approach more macroscopically over longer term, so model does show the improving trend reasonably well. So the deviation there is, as a modeler, I cannot say model is 100% perfect because there is always uncertainties and errors there. But in general, it is following the measured trend reasonably well, actually impressively well, in my opinion. Hope this answers your question.
Yes, what you're saying is that if I can simply state it, that you can make the model come out to whatever it needs to be based upon what you're going to input and how you're going to input it. And if you choose a certain procedure.
I hope not.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it's, Mr. Chairman, it has more to do with year-to-year variability and trends over time. The more time you consider, the better the model shows to be predictive. If you take shorter periods of time, you could be overestimating, underestimating. But over the longer period of time, we seem to be pretty close.
We have additional comment, Dr. Parker.
Hi, good morning, board members. My name is Julia Lester, and I'm also with Ramboll Environ. But I began my air quality career actually here at the district in the regional modeling section. Also did a lot of work on preparing AQMPs and state implementation plans. So I have sort of a perspective that's both technical and regulatory. And I think that one of the things that this district has always done really, really extraordinarily well is providing the tools to the staff that does the advanced photochemical modeling, the first ones that ever did that, so that we could come up with a very defensible air quality management plan. Because the board has to make very, very tough decisions. And in some ways it was a little easier for me back in 1994 and 1997, because the attainment days were 13 years away, 20 years away. If it was going to be wrong, I thought I'd be dead or someplace else by then. We are rapidly running out of road for one of the ozone standards, because by 2023 we have to attain. And some of the key issues that come up about the modeling are really essentially how sticky the modeling is in accounting for emission reductions and relating it to ozone, particularly over the near term. And I think, just to clarify, and I think my colleague Ralph, who I actually met when I was at the Air District, and he was on the scientific technical working group that was commenting on it. And I have continued, even since I left the district, to be an active member of that, is that this dynamic evaluations is a really important tool to have in your toolbox. And it's something that we would recommend that the district also be running. That the district be talking about it with us at the Scientific Technical Working Group, which, because of the Clean Air Act, you're required, essentially in a 2019 AQMP, to come forward and say there's no black box. Also, the control measures have to be in a regulatory form, which is a much higher bar the closer and closer you get to the attainment date. We want to make sure, I know there's an agreed sentiment by everybody, that we want to make sure we're using the variety of tools to give you the biggest variety of information for you guys to make the decisions you're going to need to make on these control measures and the strategy. So I guess my direct ask here would be is that that because essentially 2019 AQMP is next door, is that the scientific technical working group meetings go ahead and get started now, and that the district conduct its own dynamic evaluations as part of its development of the next set of, frankly, ongoing improvements in the model that they're already doing. Just add that additional arrow to their quiver and discuss it, so that when it gets to the point of doing control strategies and your decisions, on the technical side, we're all like, these are the facts, this is the variety of different information, these are the uncertainties either way, these are, how responsive your reductions that you're going to be asking for the region are going to be in terms of attaining the standard. So thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity. We've worked with staff on this for the last year and a half. The reception actually in general has been really great. They've been involved with us. Like to make it a little bit more formal, go to the scientific technical working group and make sure we're all ready for when you guys start looking at the AQMP in 2019. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. Any
One more,
further
Dr.
questions,
One more,
comments?
Dr. Parker.
One more.
Very quickly, thank you, board members. Robert Freeman from Los Angeles World Airports, or LAX as he's otherwise known. Because a picture is worth 1,000 words, I just wanted to point out that one picture of the aircraft that was in the presentation. Although airports have a very defined role in emissions in regards to aircraft, I'm sure my friends in the aviation, aircraft, and airline industry would point out that aircraft emissions performance over the last 30 years has increased amazingly. And pictures like was found of that aircraft are hard to find these days. So aircraft are far from being pollution-free. They have achieved amazing reductions, and I just wanted to state that.
Careful, Rob, it's the one category where we have increasing emissions over time and not reducing emissions like all the other categories, as you well know.
As I well know. So thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Yes, go right ahead.
Can I
Ms.
ask a
Mitchell.
question? The issue has come up from public comment to incorporate a dynamic evaluation. First of all, does that mean include retrospective modeling along with what we're presently doing? Is that what they're asking?
So EPA guidance lists dynamic modeling, dynamic evaluation, or retrospective modeling either way. Is recommended as a form of modeling, not required. But then dynamic modeling, dynamic evaluation is kind of loosely defined. One way is definitely as the public commented, that is basically you actually utilizing the exactly same tool to historical event. That's one way of defining dynamic evaluation. And another way the EPA guidance described is you utilize multiple episodes and then make multiple emissions scenarios, so to enhance the model's reliability or credibility to predict the future concentrations. But for our modeling, we include entire year for the modeling, 365 days and 24 hours each day. We model 8,624 hours in the modeling. No agency or no group in entire nation has done this extensive modeling period. And on top of it, we simulate hundreds of different emission reductions scenario. And then in the AQMP documentation, we included discussions on this, the performance of emission sensitivity test and stress test of emissions inventories. So by doing that, we are, in a way, complied with EPA's recommendation. But then step aside and then going back to directly to this public's comments on the dynamic evaluation itself. So in the modeling community, always the mentality was, so you already have done the analysis, then it is not competition to get the same result. It is always working together. Okay, how do we build on top of your findings? In that sense, why STEP was focused on utilizing their result on today's presentation. But then in-house, we have in a way to a certain extent of dynamic evaluation, meaning that we simulated 2008 ozone case that was part of 2012 AQMP. We have a simulation of 2005 ozone episode that was 2007 AQMP. And then we always going back and then re-simulated those things to ensure the current framework works and performs better than the previous frameworks. So STEP has done all these extensive evaluations in-house. So dynamic evaluation is incorporated in a way always the practice we have done it. But then the next stage is even with dynamic evaluation that is publicly presented or in-house evaluation we already did. But the next step is based on this dynamic evaluation, would our course of attainment will change, meaning that 55% NOx reduction strategies we set for the future year? Would that story come differently because of few percent of changes in the ozone concentration is actually unlikely scenario. But then again, as Steph stressed, we are not just sitting here and doing nothing. We are, is actually public also, the EMA and the Ramboll aware of the fact that 2016 AQMP performs way better than 2012 AQMP, and the 2012 AQMP was better than 2007 AQMP. So this Ramboll EMA and the public members are aware that we make progress, and then the level of errors reduces as we progress with AQMP.
So just real quickly, just one way to think of it is that what they did is they went back in time to previous years and previous emission scenarios in previous years, which have different emissions than in a current year or a future year. We do the same thing by varying emissions and varying meteorology. So we're kind of covering the same kind of modeling space in a different way. We're not doing it necessarily by time all the way back to 95, but we do model, sensitivity runs of what if there were more emissions, what if there were less emissions, and you can kind of cover some of those previous scenarios anyway. So it's a different way of kind of getting at some of the same information. But we'll work with them to work through all these issues. And if it leads to changes in the inventory or the modeling, then we're all for it. Right?
Dr. Parker, if I may, I'd like to say a couple of things. One, obviously, the better science, the better data, the better models, the better, right? We can all agree on that. We want valid models that predict accurately. However, that being said, we also do not have unlimited resources and unlimited time and unlimited staff ability to deal with everything. If we're going to spend this time fiddling at the margins over 50 to 55% or maybe to 60%, while not actually doing the work to get us the emission reductions to get us there, then we are just diverting ourselves from what the real problem and issue is. So I think staff should really consider the balance of how much effort goes into actually implementing the rules and the agreements and the incentive programs that actually get us the emission reductions than fiddling at the margins of how accurate our model is, while at the same time, still continuing to improve the model, obviously. I think this, as an information item, has been fascinating, but I also would warn you not to get too bogged down if we really are talking about a couple of percentage points of NOx emission reductions one way or the other in 2032, right? Let's get the 10, 20, 30, 40% emission reductions that we need, and then come back and make sure the models are actually spot on so that those last few really tough ones, really expensive ones, aren't over controlled.
And I would agree with that approach. Just to chime in here, that sounds like you are always continuing to improve the model. I think it's good to work with EMA and Ramboll and what they're doing, but I do agree that over just a few percentage points, we don't want to expend a lot of our human resources.
Precious resources.
Okay.
My final comment would be that, and no one has to really answer this, but to set up a procedure by which I assume we're using the same program, the same model program to input our data into. It seems to me that there may be a different consensus as to exactly at what point do we put data and what type of data do we put into that particular program. I don't think that we have a different program that we're using to do our modeling than what they're using. It's just a matter of when and how do we put, and what amount of data do we put in order to predict what will come out of it. And with that being said, I think the discussion itself with the industry and the public should be, is that this is what we're using, this is the reason why we're using it, and we believe that it can basically more predictable of what we need to know than going back, whatever number of years, or not putting in certain, whatever it may be. Because oftentimes these things come about because different people have different approaches, and they put more emphasis on this particular set of data than they do on that particular set. And for that reason, you're going to obviously come out with different results. But anyway, that's just a comment sometimes of letting people know why you're doing things and the way that you're doing them and what you intend to basically get out of it. This is important. They're saying, well, this doesn't predict what is really happening in total. But that being said, we will go on to any further comments from anyone else?
No further comments.
Thank you very much. Then we'll move on to item number 3, facility-based mobile source measures progress report.
Good morning, Dr. Parker. And thank you for taking some time for this presentation. This is a progress report on facility-based measures. Just a very quick bit of background. We came to this committee back in May earlier this year. This is a follow-up from the 2016 AQMP. There are 5 facility-based measures that were included in the AQMP that staff is pursuing. Really, the goal of these measures is to help assist CARB in implementing their further deployment measures, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the presentation. What we described for this process in the AQMP is the process that we're taking is to take a year, work with a whole variety of stakeholders of industry, community groups, et cetera, to identify voluntary measures that might be possible to get emission reductions. And to report back regularly to the board, and so that's what we're doing today with this presentation, and then we will be coming back ultimately in March with a recommendation on paths forward for these approaches. Before we get into some of the activity that we've done, I wanted to just touch very quickly on, if folks have been paying attention to the news, and especially in the last month or 2 or 3, there have been a lot of announcements, whether at the country level of weaning themselves off of gasoline and diesel fueled vehicles. A whole variety of countries have made announcements, and actually since I made this slide a week and a half ago, probably 3 more flags could be added there, right? It's day after day after day. There's more and more announcements of countries saying, by X day, we are going to stop new sales of certain kinds of cars. Similarly, vehicle manufacturers are tooling up, making plans for new factories or starting new factories, announcing new vehicle lineups that are some sort of electric or hybrid or alternative fuels. That's on the light duty side. It's on the heavier duty vehicles as well. Similar time frame there. And I think part of the reason for this is that what we've been seeing is that the cost of technology has really been coming down. There's been some information that's been coming out over the last year of looking at, for example, battery costs have been coming down maybe 75% or more over the last decade. That trend looks to be continuing as far as continued price declines. I think a lot of folks are seeing these price declines and recognizing, wow, there's some opportunity here to really reduce emissions in a big way moving forward. We do know that there are also cleaner engines. This isn't just all about batteries. There's other technologies that are out there. There's natural gas engines that are meeting the optional NOx standard really in the very near time frame right now and in the next few months. And so we know all of this is happening and all these commitments are being made. And we do know that fleets are also paying attention to this and that there are some corporate policies that are being set now to make some policies to reduce emissions and incorporate more, for example, zero emission or near zero emission vehicles into their fleets. And so we're seeing a lot of these commitments happening. What we do know is that these commitments are good, right? They're very good. They will lead to emission reductions. When we think about it for our purposes, for an AQMP and SIP credit, probably this style of commitment probably doesn't get us generally towards SIP credit. But these are good facilitating actions that are happening that we're paying attention to and we want to definitely keep encouraging. So let me get into a little bit of what we've done over the last few months. So in the last 5 months, we've had 10 working group meetings. We held a meeting with the Marine Port Committee to talk about the Port's Clean Air Action Plan. That plan is actually going back to the Harbor Commissions on November 2nd. They'll be releasing an update to that very, very soon to the draft plan. We've had dozens of individual meetings with stakeholders. And we're also continuing to develop our website and put as much information there as we can. There are also a series of related activities to what we're doing. CARB is working on their large freight facilities work. This is a fallout of their board resolution when they approved the state strategy. The CARB staff has to report back in March as well on indirect source rule concepts or alternatives. And so the CARB staff has been holding some freight workshops on this. We also are regularly speaking with CARB. We talk to them at least weekly, if not more, just to make sure that we understand what they're doing, they understand what we're doing, and the synergies make sense there. We also know that one of the things that's happened is the passage of AB 617, and there's a whole slew of components to AB 617, but one of them are community emission reduction programs. That will very likely cross over into the mobile source arena, and in some of this work of thinking about facility-based measures, there's certainly going to be some overlap there, and so we're working on all that at the same time. I want to get a little bit into what we've been covering and some of our working groups. We've talked about a framework. I'll talk about that in a minute. A lot of questions about inventory. Really the meat of it that we're trying to get to, though, are what are the emission reduction opportunities, right? How do we reduce emissions? And then there's been some discussion on SIP credit. So on this framework, this is a way of trying to organize all of the thoughts, all of the ideas that are going to be coming forward in these working groups. And so what we've set up here is a table, and the idea is to work left to right on this table. And so we can imagine on the left there, we have a bunch of background information, we move to strategies, and then implementing all these strategies. And so if we think about the rows, we could say on the left, we have these emission sources. You can imagine for a certain kind of facility, there's different emission sources. There might be trucks, there might be cars, there might be off-road equipment. Each one of those sources might get its own row. As you move across this table, you would have regulations that would apply to that source, right? There's different kinds of truck regulations, whether at the federal or state level. We know there's different kinds of technologies. There's diesel technologies, near zero emission technologies, whether they're natural gas or otherwise, et cetera. And so we can keep sort of filling this table across. We move to the right. We know there's a lot of questions about emission inventory. What are the assumptions about these technologies, about these regulations that are in our inventory? We need to make sure we understand all those assumptions clearly. But ultimately, we're trying to get to, well, what are the opportunities? We want to lay out what is this framework on the background. So where is the space to find emission reductions that go above and beyond existing regulations, that can utilize the technologies that are out there, that take into account the assumptions that are in our inventory? We know a critical piece of this is going to be the financial incentives and any other incentives that are out there. We know that that's absolutely critical to implementing all these emission reductions. One thing that we've heard a lot from many stakeholders is cost effectiveness, that whatever we do, that we have to take cost effectiveness into account. We know that is critically important, so we've added that into this framework here. Lastly, we get into implementing mechanisms. Are you doing this through regulation? Are you doing it through a voluntary MOU? Are you doing it through a contract? Are there other sorts of mechanisms to do this? And then ultimately, can we get SIP credit for these emission reductions, right? So we developed this framework, and we're busy trying to fill all these spaces in with all of the information that's out there. Moving on to the inventory, the slide right now, these bar charts show the inventory that's included in the 2016 AQMP, and on the left we see the base year 2012, all those multiple colors. That large green one on the top left, for example, is the heavy-duty diesel trucks, largest emission source in 2012. We move forward through time to 2023, and you see that colored chart gets significantly smaller. That's the existing rules and regulations in place that will reduce emissions dramatically between 2012 and 2023. Unfortunately, it's not enough. We know that our carrying capacity, how much NOx emissions are allowed to meet our ozone standards, is much lower. We need a 45% reduction beyond what's shown in those color charts, and then another 55% looking in 2031. There's a different way of looking at this chart. What I'm doing here is zooming in to the 2023 and 2031. We have those same colors on the left for each, for each year. Excuse me. But what's on the right is showing the control strategy. And so we see the carrying capacity is that bottom blue striped bar. And then as you move on up, we get into the AQMD strategy on stationary sources. For example, of cleaner equipment at stationary sources. Then we get into the sort of defined strategies for mobile sources, and this would largely be through incentive programs. We have a whole variety of incentive programs, whether they're Carl Moyer or otherwise, that we believe we can get SIP credit for those emission reductions. The state also has similar defined incentive measures or other regulations that they're planning, and there's emission reductions associated with those regulations that are in development right now. But then we get to that top part, and there's 108 tons there shown in 2023 of further deployment. And this is a little bit looser, and there's a whole variety of strategies that have been discussed in the AQMP and in the state strategy to try to get these emission reductions. Ultimately, there is a state commitment to get this 108 tons, and that's, again, largely through incentives, but if there are other efficiencies that can be gained or other sorts of measures that can be taken, that's what we're pursuing. The facility-based measures fit within that 108 tons in 2023. How can we help to get to that? We know it will not get all of 108. It will not get 100, but it will get some fraction, right? And so that's what we're pursuing right now. This really, again, is really the point of what we're trying to get at, emission reduction opportunities. I don't want to go through every one of these little boxes here. There's many other boxes that are out there. These are a variety of ideas that have been put forward in our working groups of what are ways to get emission reductions. And some of these have actually, there's been action on these since the AQMP was passed. So for example, alternative fuel policies, LAX just revised their alternative fuel policy not just a few weeks ago. Clean Air Action Plan is going through an update right now. You look at CEQA mitigation, there are new projects coming online that have new kinds of mitigation, new air quality mitigation or mitigation funds that are out there. So there's active development on this that is we're paying attention to and trying to take part in. And so we're trying to see how to take advantage of these opportunities. One of the things that we're keenly aware of, though, it's to move from a generalized approach into actual specifics, right? How can you specifically get an emission reduction from something? And so that's one of the things that we're really working on with all of these working groups. Finally, one of the questions that's really come up a lot early on was how do you get SIP credit, especially if it's not a regulation. So we know traditionally a regulation you can get SIP credit. You can meet all of the EPA's integrity elements. It's permanent, enforceable, quantifiable, and surplus, and real. So we know regulation gets us there, but there are other mechanisms. So an MOU approach can work. For example, the 1998 MOU between CARB and UP and BNSF to ensure that in the South Coast Basin, there on average will be Tier 2 locomotives. That was put in place by 2020 or by 2010. I'm sorry, and it's still in force today. So that's one approach. There's other kinds of ways to structure an MOU to maybe get SIP credit. Contracts, like through incentive programs, whether it's Carl Moyer or other sorts of financial incentive programs. There are ways to try to get SIP credit through that sort of mechanism. What I've shown here in a slightly different color is the emissions inventory adjustments. We've heard the last two presentations, a lot of discussion about emissions inventory. It doesn't work exactly the same when it comes to thinking about emission reductions, but an adjustment in the inventory affects the SIP and what we need to do. And so we're always adjusting that, as you've heard in these last presentations. We've had a lot of discussion, a lot of questions about this as we're going through our working groups. We know that that's part of the process, but ultimately emission reductions we know are the key. I want to touch on a few questions that have come up pretty repeatedly. Again, talking about inventory, what's in the inventory, what are the key assumptions that are in the inventory? Let's get into the weeds, and there's been a lot of work on that. Another question again, it's sort of this repeated theme. So if you improve the inventory, what does that do for emission reductions? And does it actually, just by improving the inventory, can you get rid of the reduction need? No, that's a pretty easy answer to make, but we do need to understand that inventory and all those assumptions. That is really critical. We have talked a lot about the details of how would a voluntary action be SIP creditable. So for example, with the ports, with what they're doing with the Clean Air Action Plan, how can we get credit for that in the SIP? Do you do that overall on the entire Clean Air Action Plan, for example, on individual measures within it? How do you structure it? So there has been a lot of discussion on this. I think the summary is that there's more than one way to do this, right? We don't have to rely on a single way. We just need to make sure to meet the EPA integrity elements, but there are many mechanisms possible. It's going to depend on each individual measure, and we're committed to trying to make it work. One of the things that we tried to bring up during our last working groups was not just what is the whole range of actions that are out there, which ones should be pursued, and which ones should we go after first. In particular, if we think about the level of incentive funding that's available, there's more funding that's been made available just in the last few months. So what do we do with that? How do we spend that the best way first? And thinking about that moving forward in future years, in the upcoming years, what do we pursue first? So that's one of the things that we're trying to get at. Enforceability has been a big question, especially when it comes to voluntary commitments. And the idea behind a voluntary commitment is that some entity will voluntarily say, I will make some emission reduction. They will come up with whatever that voluntary approach is. But then how do you make that enforceable? How do you hold someone to the commitment that they made, right? And that's the question that there's one of the things that we've really been trying to address. And again, through these MOU contracts, other sorts of mechanisms, there's definitely ways to do this. And finally, one of the things that we really need to get at as we're moving towards March are these voluntary actions on their own sufficient to give us the emission reductions that we need? We know we need a 45% reduction by 2023. Are we getting along that path? And what can we do with that? So these are all questions that we're trying to get at right now. There's very fine font on here. I apologize for that. I just wanted to touch very briefly on each of the individual sectors that are out there. So on airports, there's some letters that were sent out last night. There's been a lot of questions that have been coming up on inventory. We're working on that. We've requested information from all of the airports in the last few weeks. We're still waiting on some of that information to come through, and we're committed to continuing to talk with them about that. One of the other questions that's also come up are existing voluntary actions that have been taken by airports included in the inventory? The answer is depends on which one. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and we're working through the details of that. If you look at something like an alternative fuel policy on light-duty vehicles, that's probably already within the inventory itself, smeared in amongst the entire transportation model. If you're looking at specific electrification of ground support equipment, maybe that's in, maybe it's not. So we're looking at those details. When it comes to marine ports, everything is really about the Clean Air Action Plan right now. We just had a call yesterday with the ports, actually, with port staff to try to understand sort of their process as they're moving towards November 2nd. We're having some productive discussions with them. I think ultimately the big question is sort of fair share of ports doing their fair share of emission reductions, especially given the size of that emission source down there. On new and redevelopment, there's been a good suggestion. We've heard from some stakeholders to take a look at some of the existing planning efforts that have occurred, especially with climate action plans. These have taken off in some parts of the state, especially up in the Bay Area. Not as much down here in Southern California, but there are some jurisdictions that have done it. So we are taking a look to see are there co-benefits from those GHG reduction strategies when it comes to NOx or VOCs. But really, I think one of the things that's becoming clear, especially with new and redevelopment, are the construction fleets. What can we do to reduce emissions there? That's the biggest source of emissions in many new developments. Rail yards, I think a phrase we've heard from many people is that's a tough nut to crack. And we're working on trying to understand, well, what is the space there to try to find emission reductions. I think one of the things that we have heard more recently, what is the emissions profile? What are the health risks from rail yards? There was an effort by ARB to conduct a bunch of health risk assessments back in 2008. Those inventories are from 2005 through 2008 period. They're a bit old right now. What is the equipment profile? What does all that look like today? That will help inform where are the emission reduction opportunities. So that's one thing we're trying to get an understanding of. But ultimately, that doesn't get at emission reductions. We know that that's important, and especially there's some really big challenges thinking about it on the locomotive side. We know for certain fleets like Metrolink that our agency has done a lot to help fund clean locomotives there, and that can have a pretty significant effect, especially for a captive fleet. But when you have a national fleet, there are some different challenges there. Finally, on warehouses, we've heard this at some of our meetings as well as at some of ARB's meetings. There's been real concern about compliance and where, for example, where are trucks driving? Are they following their truck routes in the local neighborhoods? We've heard from some trucking companies as well. Are there companies that are actually complying with what they should be doing? Are they doing the minimizing their idling? Are their engines actually meeting the standards that they're supposed to be meeting? There's questions about some of the newer engines and whether the warranty is working correctly on them. So there's a lot of questions about compliance when it comes to trucks at warehouses. And so we're working on that. But ultimately, how do you reduce emissions when warehouse owners typically don't own the truck fleets? They might have some portion of the fleet, but not all of it. So that's one of the key questions when it comes to warehouses. Wrapping up here, so looking at our future working group meetings, we've had a lot of meetings so far. We know that we're going to be coming back to this committee in February, so there's only a little bit of time, and also knowing the holidays, we're planning probably just 2 working group sessions over the next few months. We do plan to keep talking about the inventory. We need to be talking about also what are the potential reductions from what has been put forward as some potential voluntary actions. How much can those actually give us? How many tons a day, for example? We do also want to talk with these working groups a little bit about some of the regulatory concepts and just sort of start talking about some of these concepts. We want to have a little bit of this discussion before we come back to board so that we can get a little bit of reaction from some of the stakeholders on ways that this could potentially work. And again, we know cost effectiveness is really going to be key moving forward. We're going to wrap all that up certainly over these next 2 working groups, but we know that that's something to talk about. Finally, we will continue to work through our framework that I described. CARB is continuing to hold its workshops on large freight facilities. We have our funding working group. There was a notice that went out, I think, also for November 2nd on that one. So we'll have that working group in the near future here, and then we'll come back to this committee and then back to the full board. And with that, I think that's my last slide.
Thank you very much, Ian. Do we have a time frame that another committee is going to be starting, Mr. Nastri?
10:30.
Okay. And we're at 10:28. Yes, Supervisor Kuehl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some of the same questions that I had when we were adopting the AQMP. So one of the questions raised in your 10th slide was, will voluntary actions on their own provide sufficient emission reductions? And I mean, it's a report, this is a topic of discussion, in these groups. But the question to you is, will voluntary actions get us where we need to go in any of these categories so far as you can tell? I never had very much faith, as you know, that the voluntary reductions alone would do it. We had a lot of discussion about incentives. And if I'm saying to you, look, I'm happy to voluntarily do this, but I can't do it without some kind of monetary incentive because it's expensive. So we made a lot of suggestions about how those incentives could be found. And I'm assuming the funding, the AQMP funding group is looking at them. But what can you tell me directly about whether there is any reason to have any confidence that voluntary actions on their own will get us where we need to be in any of these arenas? And were there new incentives included in the state budget that was adopted in the summer, for instance, or anywhere that would give me any confidence that there might be some funding for some of these voluntary actions?
So Supervisor, let me answer that question, if you don't mind. So in part, this is a report back to you and the board about the progress that's been made. And I can share with you that I had the opportunity to go to the last series. And there were 2 sessions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And I think that the morning session was pretty much routine from the perspective of these were how the meetings have been conducted. And my concern in attending that meeting was that there wasn't a good dialogue. There wasn't a good exchange of ideas. And so I had asked Ian in the afternoon to change it a bit and to change the format in a way that was very similar to how at EPA we had developed the collaborative functions. And there was a much more robust discussion, I would say, in those working groups. It could have been just that they were different groups. But the key that we have to do is to identify what are those opportunities so that we can answer your question as, is there really an opportunity from a voluntary perspective? And what we try to do is to identify not what's being limited, not what we can't do, but what is the realm of possibility. And then you look at it from the perspective of the funding and what it would take to implement it. So staff is working on developing that universe. I'm still confident that we can develop and we can determine and report back to you and the board whether that's a viable function. Today, we're at a very different place than we were 6 months ago. in terms of funding and incentive funding. I unfortunately wasn't at the last legislative committee meeting, but I don't know if it was said, but I'll say it. We've probably had the most successful legislative session in the history of the South Coast AQMD this last session. We anticipate anywhere from $200 to $400 million in funding out of everything that came out. We have a pot of guaranteed funding under 617 of 108 million. Right now, we're in discussions for incentives for looking at risk reduction. So part of what we've been really focused on is trying to have that funding available to do these things. And I think that we're now at a point where we can go, for instance, to the ports, the Clean Air Action Plan, and say, there's an opportunity to realize some of the things that we're talking about through these funds that we have. I believe that we have funding, not as much as we need, but we have enough funding to demonstrate that we can implement these programs. More importantly, we have to not only implement these programs, we have to do it quickly, because the entire intent, from what we understand, was to show that we can spend this money so that with the legislature can go back and justify a longer-term commitment and tie it into the greenhouse gas.
As a matter of public policy, I have to say I don't find that very helpful. But again, it's my position that using tax money to essentially deal with the pollution created by private industry is not exactly the best way to go. It's essentially what we were resorted to in terms of excise cleanup because you can't get the company to do it. But what we're really saying is you don't have to do anything at these arenas unless we can help you with tax money. And so, okay, I understand that. This was what we decided we would adopt as incentives, and that's what we meant by incentives. So I'm certainly happy that we will have some and perhaps see some reductions. I'm more interested even though in consequences, because one of the conversations we had when we adopted the AQMP was what we would do if they didn't meet their voluntary goals.
Right.
And we said, well, we're not going to start drafting anything right away. So my final question is, what will happen and when they don't meet their goals, even with incentives?
Well, the commitment that I'd made was if I wasn't pleased with the progress that we were making, we would pivot to rulemaking. And the concept has always been that as we engage in this process, these are all the steps that we would have to engage in if we were actually doing rulemaking from the very onset. So from my perspective, we wouldn't be losing time because we understand the importance of timing to get those emission reductions. So we're not losing time. We're still defining what that universe may be in terms of potential emission reductions. The question and the onus that we put to the members of the working group were, you're going to work with us one way or another. This is a good way to work with us, but we're going to define what that universe is and what those opportunities are if you're not going to work with us. And maybe in part that was why we had more of a robust discussion, but we're going to continue along that path so that we're not losing time to move to that rulemaking. But I think that the intent was, give us a year, and at that year we come back to you and the fellow board members and say, here's what we've come, here's where we think are some good opportunities, here's where we think perhaps there aren't good opportunities from an incentive perspective, but maybe from a regulatory rulemaking perspective, that makes sense. But I would just say, it's been 6 months, I think we're making progress. If we weren't making that progress, we would be coming back to you with a much different presentation.
Okay, I thank you. I think often we credit progress and put off any action on our part because kind of, well, they're trying, they made some progress. And I think it's a question of how we will, when do you give up on voluntary attempts, even if it's incrementally getting there? And one of the reasons I'm most concerned is that with the threat to whether we'll be able to maintain the kind of health care that we provide for, in a county of 10 million people, these issues are directly related to the costs of our healthcare in our, in our 4 counties at least. And often we don't put them together and say, this needs to be more regulated because I'm dealing with 4 million cases of asthma in these particular, sectors and areas. So if I seem a little bit adamant about it, it's partly because I'd rather use the tax money for something else, and more than that, I'd rather have my children and young people be more healthy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So, I just want to add, so as you
Yes,
mentioned, sorry, Dr. Parker, if I may, we are, I don't want to get ahead of the working groups, but the staff is working on regulatory concepts. We need to discuss those with the working group before we come back in February and March to make recommendations to the board of which way to go. And it may be very different recommendations for different sectors, right? I think one of the challenges is what are the opportunities in certain sector. The opportunities above and beyond what CARB is doing or existing regulations are doing might be very small, and we may have a different recommendation for that where we find a huge opportunity and may not have a voluntary pathway forward. So all 5 will have probably a very different type of recommendation, but we are thinking that way. We are thinking through regulatory concepts for many years.
Thank you very much.
One of the things that I think that we should recognize, and first of all, I agree with Supervisor Gill that it is a real good not a good concept all the time to say we're going to take taxpayers' monies and solve private matters. However, one of the ones that I would like to see our agency concentrate on, which I believe that is one of the directions that we're going to be headed into, we have a serious problem with NOx concentration in our region. And for that, we have also a serious problem because we have the 2 largest ports probably in the United States that is directly related here. And we have diesel trucks that are basically going up and down major corridors. We've got to find some kind of way in order to stifle our economic benefits that we gain from that, but also to incentivize those people to convert from the type of vehicles that they're using that is spewing this NOx out in this environment to something different. We may have to use a certain portion of state funding, whatever that percentage itself is, in order to get people to convert. And once they convert, then we can look at the rulemaking itself saying you can't go back. This is the way itself of the future. And then that way we are basically accomplishing 2 things, not on a long-term basis, but on an interim basis in order to get there. And I think that the last 2 weeks, it's just such that I've been involved in looking at ways of doing that. Last Tuesday, I was in Sacramento at the Fuel Cell Partnership, and we're talking about just how can we get these large trucks now, maybe to start using hydrogen instead of diesel. A week before that, we were in Berlin and Amsterdam and Rotterdam talking about how we can get these large-scale trucks maybe to some other kind of form of usage, catenaries, and all of the other kind of approaches, instead of basically using diesel fuel. So whatever we can do in order to get there, I think you're right. We can't basically just say we're going to take taxpayers' dollars and do this, because there's a limit to that. And that's really kind of like throwing good money down a rabbit hole if we don't have a long-term approach. But I believe that our long-term approach will be exactly what you're saying, Supervisor, is that we basically pivot into rulemaking and saying, this is what we've proven now, this can work. And if we have to have some infrastructure in order to make that happen, then the government actually has to step in and help us to do that. So I agree with what you're saying, but also the approach that we're getting there. And I was glad to hear that Mr. Nastri said that we will pivot to rulemaking if we find out these processes that we are choosing, or these roads that we're choosing, are not going to work, and not in a long term, but in a short term basis for us. Any other comments by any of my other colleagues?
I think I agree with everyone. I know we talk about carrots and sticks. We have either a mighty big carrot or some carrot cake to be offering right now. But I like Sheila's concept of you know, a carrot on a stick or a carrot cake on a stick. So I'm willing to do both. I think everyone has good points here.
Well,
Looks like a carrot, but
I think incentives will get us there faster.
Go right ahead, Mr. Ashton.
Yeah, I'll just say, you know, I agree with, you know, a lot of what's been said here, but I think our incentive program will help us get there faster.
Yes. I agree. Any other comments? Anyone from public comments? Because I think we're running behind in our time frame.
No public comments. Sorry, Dr. Parker. There is a public comment.
Good morning, Council. Tamara McCrossan-Orr from Los Angeles World Airports. I just wanted to emphasize a few points that we made in our letter that we sent out yesterday. We have been working closely with staff on the facility-based measures and other items. But one point about aircraft and airports, the majority of emissions from airports come from aircraft. And that is currently about 84% of those emissions come from the aircraft. By 2023, it's estimated that that will grow to over 90% of the emissions will come from aircraft. So that leaves a very small portion of emissions that airports can actually control. Nevertheless, airports, LAWA in particular, and the other airports in the region have been working for years on emission reduction activities. One program that we like to talk about is our ground support emissions reduction program. We passed that policy in 2015, and we've already seen a 45% reduction in emissions from that program from the 2013 baseline. And that's a hugely successful program. We've actually already met our goal. We had a target emissions goal for 2021. We've already exceeded that goal. And I'd just like to emphasize this program, we worked on this program in collaboration with the airlines, who are the primary operators and owners of the GSE, and also third-party operators of GSEs. So there are certain companies that run ground support equipment for airlines. The airports generally do not own or operate ground support equipment. It does vary from airport to airport, but at LAX, LAWA does not own any ground support equipment. So that program has been hugely successful. I think it's a great model for an approach that we can take without regulation. We worked collaboratively. We started with state regulations that operators already have to comply with, and we said, what can we do to better those, to do better than the state regulations already require you to do? And what we came up with the operators is that they would have to meet those statewide regulations right in LAX. And we know that LAX is surrounded by disadvantaged communities, and that makes it a really important effort that we were able to do. We didn't want airlines to be able to meet their statewide goals by using dirty equipment at LAX, because it's a very expensive place to operate, and using their clean equipment in Sacramento and San Diego and San Francisco. So we forced them to bring that clean equipment to LAX. We want to build on the success of a program like the Ground Support Emissions Reduction Program and tackle the other sources that the airport has control over. And one of those is we recently worked with Board Member Liu and members of the community and stakeholders on our alternative fuel vehicle program. And this program targets medium and heavy duty vehicles that operate at the airport. So these are operators that we have a contractual relationship with. So we were able to leverage that relationship to impose stricter requirements on them. I think it's approaches like the Ground Support Emissions Reduction Program and the Alternative Fuel Vehicle Policy that we hope to work with staff and to show board members that these programs can be very successful without regulation. One of the second points that we make in our letter is that there are federal pots of incentive funding available to airports, but they require that your programs be voluntary, your actions be voluntary. If your actions are not voluntary, you're not available for these funds. And they're significant, they're at least a 50% match. And many airports use these funds to bring zero emission equipment to airports. LAX recently used these VAIL funds, it's the FAA Voluntary Low Emission Program, to electrify aircraft parking positions. And we don't want to lose access to those funds to do this good work. Finally, I just want to, we really are committed to the goals. We share the same goals as the district, and we are committed to continue working collaboratively with staff to develop these emissions inventories and to work on our programs. Thank you for your time.
Dr. Parker, in the interest of moving this, we've got Vice Chair Benoit waiting to get started on the next committee. We're over 15 minutes, so I ask that.
All right, I will wrap this up. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, unless we have somebody else from the public that wants to make a comment, we can very quickly.
This is Peter Herzog with NAAQS, the Commercial Real Estate Development Association, and I'll be quick so I don't make Mr. Benoit unhappy.
He's already unhappy.
More unhappy. I would just like to kind of echo what Mr. Nastri and Mr. Ashley pointed out. Industry is doing a lot, and it is costing a lot of money, and they are doing it without regulations. Is there more to do? Yes. I think in the conversations we had in the afternoon sessions, that was pointed out, and the industry is interested in talking about it. So the concept that, we're sitting around saying we don't have to do anything, I've never heard Mr. Nastri, Mr. McMillan, or Mr. Fine ever say we don't have to do anything, and guarantee that. And we've never said we don't have to do anything. That is being worked on. But the key point, both CARB and this organization has indicated that if we're going to get close to attainment, it's got to be through technology and getting the types of engines that are necessary. And that it takes time and it takes money. The California Trucking Association is investing a lot of money in cleaning up trucks. They are preparing actually proposals with the state to improve enforcement of the current rules. They actually put a statute in that deals with registration of trucks. So they are acting. And so that is moving forward, and this really should be, I think, the continued discussion that we have had on a collaborative basis, a partnership, and that's the way to go. And where the incentives are important, again, isn't that everybody's just sitting back and saying, you guys all pay for it. It's that the technology is coming. It's just a question of when. If you want to expedite that technology, that you indicate.
I'm going to ask you to kind of summarize.
That's what I'm doing right now. If you actually want to move this up faster than what can be done, then that's where the incentives come in. That's the purpose of it. And the sole purpose is to move things along faster. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay, hearing none, then the reports itself, that the written reports will be, unless there's an objection, will be received and filed. And other matters, there being none, then we will have our next meeting on November 17th, 2017.
Just to make sure, Dr. Parker, any other public comment? There's no further public comment here, Dr. Parker.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we'll be in adjournment until September 17th, 2007. Thank you. Bye-bye.